Hello everyone, Michael Brady here from Brady Musical Instruments. I've got something really different for this video that I think is going to be something that will be very interesting to touch upon that I really haven't seen done in the Ocarina community before. So as you might have guessed, this ocarina that I have with me is not one of the ocarinas that I've ever made before. This is not my ocarina. This is not a new offering, unfortunately. Um, this is actually a vintage alto Albright Harmony ocarina that I just spent the past 2 months restoring to its former glory. So before I got this ocarina, it was actually not functional. And I went through a lot of unique processes in order to get this ocarina working again. So over the course of this video, I'm going to be actually discussing the background of this, what kind of led up to this repair and restoration, talk about some repair and restoration aspects in regards to wooden ocarinas and woodwinds in general, kind of touching into areas of instrument making in terms of woods and some other things that can happen, give my thoughts and perspectives on it, and just take a closer look at what went into this restoration. So as a little bit of a background, my customer who sent me this ocarina kind of reached out to me through one of the ocarina communities. And prior, they had purchased this ocarina from a vintage shop used. They got it about a year ago. They hadn't really played it all that much. And then one day, they actually found that the side on the larger chamber was cracked wide open. There was a big split in it, and it rendered the ocarina unfortunately unplayable. So they went around and they asked a bunch of woodwind and instrument repair shops to see if anyone could help, because again, a wooden ocarina is really a woodwind. Much like a recorder, it has similar style of voicing, and it's made out of wood. So you would think that either an instrument repair shop or a woodwind specialty shop or even a antique restoration type service would be able to help with something with this. And unfortunately, that's really not the case. For standard orchestral woodwinds like clarinets or oboes or even violins or stuff like that, those are very common instruments. Those are instruments that dealt with all the time with instrument makers and luthiers and repair people in the shop, and that is something people are very familiar with. Bringing a very unconventional instrument like this that most people probably haven't worked with before, well, they might look at it for you because they don't have the experience with this particular type of instrument. There's probably going to be a lot of hesitation to do a repair, especially a major repair on something that they're not familiar with that's not working. And that's what my customer found. They found that none of the shops they went to, none of the repair people they went to, really wanted to touch this instrument. So they had actually ended up reaching out at one point to the Von Huna workshop in Boston. So I've talked about the Von Huna workshop before. I had an amazing opportunity meeting with them several times, especially in the course of preparing for the Boston Early Music Festival in 2025. And apparently, they actually recommended the customer to reach out to me because they actually knew I was a wooden ocarina maker, and they suggested that I might be able to help. So the member in the community reached out to me, and we kind of went from there. So I think it was actually pretty cool to actually get some recognition from one of the most respected recorder making shops in the world to kind of look at an instrument like this. Just kind of as a brief background, wooden ocarinas actually have a pretty long history in the U.S., surprisingly. The first wooden ocarinas in the U.S. appeared from the potato bugs in the 1930s. There's actually a little bit of a snippet of this on Charlie Hines' website that deals with some of the history of the ocarina, and they started producing wooden sweet potato ocarinas, I think, in around the 30s or so. Then you're followed up with Albright, who really created these very well-known harmony-style ocarinas through the 70s and 80s. You have Hind, who's very well known, who started ocarina making in the 80s and continued all the way up in the early 2020s. And then you have kind of other shops that popped up here and there through the course of time, like a North County Workshop, who took over for the Albright Workshop, making these harmonies for several years. Now, at this point, as far as I'm aware, my efforts, Brady Musical Instruments, is really the only active ocarina shop in the U.S. currently. Now that kind of Hind has stepped back, and Albright and North County Workshop and these others really aren't producing these ocarinas anymore. Now there might be some other small wooden makers here and there, but in terms of being active with the community, in terms of working on really higher end wooden ocarinas and trying to push things like inline ocarinas to a new level, I do think at this time I'm really the only active maker again in the US doing wooden ocarinas like this. So this gives me kind of a unique perspective on this particular style of instrument, not only because I know how they work, how they're put together, how they're voiced, but just what goes into the craft of wooden ocarinas. So this kind of gives me an opportunity to be able to leverage my skills to not only make new ocarinas for people, but to also now help people out with ocarinas of their own that don't come from me, but are wood. There's a lot of secondhand ocarinas, wooden ocarinas that come up now and then that people sell, that you might find in vintage shops or on eBay or through private trades or what have you. And they come in various states. They can be in very good, pristine condition. They can be really rough. They can be cracked. They can be chipped. And again, because the ocarina is a very niche instrument, very unique instrument, there really isn't anyone offering conventional repair and restoration services for these wooden ocarinas. Again, it's going to be kind of rare that someone would request this, but I think it is something that has been a bit missing in the ocarina community now, as people are getting more into the ocarina, and there's been a lot of surge in demand and popularity for vintage ocarinas like Hines, like these Albrights, that you see more and more of these coming up secondhand and used, and people acquiring them for historical purposes, for collection purposes. I have two Hines of my own that I bought over a decade ago that are still in absolutely beautiful condition. So I've been able to kind of explore the ocarina from multiple facets over the years, in pertaining to wooden ocarinas. So I would say, kind of as a note with the start of this video, I am now officially going to be offering repair and restoration services for wooden ocarinas specifically, and I'll get more into what that entails kind of later in this video. So this customer came to me with this ocarina. They asked me, hey, can you take a look at this? Is this something that could be fixed? What could be done? And, I looked at some of the pictures they sent me, and there's a number of things that came up in my minds that could be immediately looked at. And I told them, you know what, I think this is actually something that could be doable. So I worked out kind of the details with them. I kind of explained all the different things that could be done, all the steps that I would take, make sure they'd be comfortable with me working on this ocarina in the way that I proposed. And then we arranged to meet up. They actually are in the same state, so I was able to grab the ocarina from them directly during a meetup, and kind of go from there and assess the situation. So, like I mentioned, this ocarina was cracked on the larger chamber. Now, the Albrights, they have a very specific known style. First off, it's this shape that is kind of that was really started with Albright himself. And there are two chambers. There's the high chamber on the right side and the low chamber on the left side. And it was the low chamber, there's the seam here between the top and the bottom halves that opened up. These are old ocarinas. They can span several decades, and there's a lot of things that wooden instruments kind of undergo over the course of time. And even the best made instruments with the best made woods and the best made practices, they can still suffer from environmental changes, from small cracks, from large cracks, from glue seams popping open. Wood is a natural living material. It's going to change with the environment, with time, especially things with humidity and temperature. And again, even the best made instruments in the world, even if you take care of them absolutely the best you can, there's always still a chance that something can happen. It can happen with brand new instruments. It can happen with old instruments. It's something that you can mitigate, but not necessarily always prevent. So that shouldn't be something to deter people away from wooden ocarinas, from wooden instruments in general. It's just kind of something that happens with wood over time. So I got the ocarina, I started inspecting it, and I kind of formulated a plan to figure out how to tackle this crack. So what did this ocarina actually look like when I received it? Well, we can actually take a look at some shots of what it was like prior. So this is a picture that I received directly from the customer, showing me kind of the damage to the instrument and kind of what I had to work with. It's always hard to kind of gauge what to do from pictures, but I think this gave me a very clear idea of what was happening just from seeing the picture alone. So we can see here in the picture that there's a pretty large gap at the seam. It's split almost completely along the larger seam of the large chamber. And that's a pretty large gap. That's about a 1 to 2 millimeter gap. And we can immediately see that because the gap is uneven, this ocarina has experienced warping. So this immediately renders that first chamber completely unplayable, or the larger chamber completely unplayable. The smaller chamber was still intact. It was still playable. The customer could still use it, but they could not use the whole ocarina because of this large split. So why does something like this occur? So as you know, wood has a natural grain to it. Depending on how the wood is cut, you're going to have different grain orientations. It could be very vertical, like in quarter sawn wood. It can be kind of had that cathedral effect in flat sawn wood. There's various ways to cut wood, and depending on how that wood is cut, it's going to change kind of the stability and how the wood behaves under different conditions. This is why like guitar makers and violin makers and string makers pay a lot of attention to the grain, especially for the soundboards, because you want very stable soundboard. You want very stable necks, so the grain has to be oriented a particular way, so that way when it experiences changes in humidity, it's more resistant to warping. Now, different woods are going to be more stable than others. Some shift a lot, some shift not as much. Different cuts of wood are going to be more stable to warping than others. But also how the wood is shaped is a factor too. So actually kind of to bring into this discussion, what I have here is a perfect example of warping. This is a cutoff of a very thin 1/8 inch piece of Bloodwood. I use Bloodwood for a lot of ocarinas. It's a beautiful wood. It is one of those woods that in very thin stalks just left on the shelf, it can be very prone to warping. And this is true for other woods, kind of like zebra wood or some other exotic woods that are just kind of prone to twisting and propelling. And you can actually see this wood is pretty bent. It's warped, kind of bowed like this. Now, why does something like this occur? Let's just say the wood has just been sitting on the shelf, just flat down. Actually, it'd be kind of like this, flat down, for a long time, and experiences natural changes in humidity and temperature over the seasons, especially if the room it's stored in is not in a climate-controlled environment, and it's just kind of sitting in a stack, just or out on the table. One side that's on the table, if it's sitting on a table, is going to be kind of closed, whereas the other side, open to the top, is more exposed to the air, more exposed to the changes in humidity. So it's going to fluctuate more on one side. In very dry conditions, where dryness is one of the dangers for wood instruments, getting too dry causes cracking. The side that is exposed to the really dry air is going to lose moisture much more rapidly than the side that is on the table. So what happens as the moisture leaves, the wood shrinks and it contracts and it lifts up and you get this bowing shape. And that is what can cause the warping for especially thin stock. Thick stock can also experience this too, but you see this you see this a lot, specifically with certain woods in the thin stock. And that is really exactly what we've seen. So if we go back to the picture, we can see that there is that split. And this happens in the ocarina's case for several reasons. First off, the inside of the ocarina creates kind of this enclosed microclimate. So it's an enclosed volume, and it's going to experience changes in temperature and humidity much differently than the outside. So you have this area that's closed, and then you have the area that's exposed open. Well, the open exposed area on the outside is going to see fluctuations in humidity faster than the inside. So in a very dry season, for example, moisture is going to leave the wood more readily on the outside. It's going to cause the grain to start to shrink and contract. And if the glue seam is not strong enough, especially if it's old glue, it's going to cause it to pop apart at the seam. And that's exactly what we saw happen. Now, the smaller chamber side, this is not an issue. And you have more support here. It's a smaller lever arm for this to occur. So think if you're trying to bend a very long stick versus a very short stick at the same diameter. The longer stick is going to be easier to flex, where the shorter one is going to be much more stiff. So this side, the smaller side, has more resistance to that bending and changing versus the wider side, which is more prone to acting like a lever. The other issue you have here is the shape. Not saying the shape is wrong or bad or anything, but in ocarinas, especially with transverse ocarinas, the shape is very asymmetric. And when you're carving wood in a very asymmetric shape, it's going to experience potentially very different forces acting on it. Thicker areas are going to react differently than thinner areas. So you have this now contrast in the outer and inner environment, which causes the rapid shrinking of the outside more than the inside. You have an asymmetrical shape, and you also have kind of the grain. So the grain might have also played a role in this. It's very kind of wider and open on the side with less rings. So it may be, in this case, for this particular species, I don't know what species this is, but it's an unknown species, which is another unknown working with these woods. That makes it a little bit of a challenge. The species might be more prone to fluctuating in the wider grain versus the narrow grain. And I have seen this with certain species. Zebra wood is a classic example. For really straight, tight-grained zebra wood, you would think conventionally that the forces would be very even and it would warp. It would be resistant to warping. That's actually not the case. I've actually found that very even, straight-grained zebra wood actually bows very readily like the bloodwood, whereas really wavy, wild, wide-grained zebra wood naturally resists this bending, which is pretty interesting, I think, a little bit different than what you would expect from some other woods. Finally, there's also kind of how the instrument is sealed. Now, after I got it and I inspected the inside, I noticed that the inside was quite shiny, and it seems like the inside was actually sealed with something. The outside, it does have this kind of sheen to it, but it's not sealed in the sense that I seal my ocarinas, for example, with many layers of a penetrating, hardening oil varnish that builds on top of the surface and really seals it. This wood is really exposed out there and is something that has to kind of be oiled over time and maintained. And that is something that happens with a lot of wooden ocarinas and a lot of wooden ocarina makers, is that they are not fully sealed. So you have to do oiling. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's more a little bit more effort and care on the customer side. And that's one of the reasons why I fully seal all my ocarinas, because I want to take all the steps I can to prevent major shifts in the humidity and things going wrong like this with my particular ocarinas. For example, my Hind inline ocarina that's fully sealed on the outside, it is not sealed on the inside, but it's perfectly fine after more than a decade. My Hind sweet potato, those are not really sealed. They're kind of, I think he just puts on just like an oil finish or like varnish finish. But technically they do have to be oiled and maintained maybe over time. I've never done that with my Hind, and it's been perfectly fine for all these years. So different instruments, different finishes and things can help or mitigate with certain effects like this, but it's not always the case. So now that we saw that there was this split and we kind of know why this split occurred, again, because in very dry conditions, the grain is going to lose moisture. The exposed grain is going to lose moisture more rapidly than the enclosed grain, so it's going to cause it to shrink and open up at that seam. And because these are older ocarinas, it could have been made in the 70s, 80s, maybe 90s. Depending on the glue that was used, maybe the glue didn't hold up over time or just degrades over time, and it just caused it to weaken and fail. So now that we know that there is the seam, what are the courses of action? Well, immediately seeing the seam from the pictures, I could tell there's a number of things that could have been done. The first one is, for a large crack like this, you can just fill it. You can fill it with putty, wood filler, epoxy, super glue and dust, wood glue and dust, and stuff like that. In a case like this, a split at the seam, especially a large one that has structural integrity implications, that is a very bad idea. It's a simple fix. It's a quick fix. It's going to look a bit unsightly. It'll be noticeable, especially if you don't have the exact wood to make your own filler. It's going to stand out. And even with filler, it's going to stand out. But the issue here is that Albright's ocarinas have thick walls. They're heavy. The wall thickness is about 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 an inch. So getting wood filler into that crack, even though it's a wide crack, cramming that wood filler into that crack all the way evenly so it coats both surfaces and gets a full seal, especially in the areas where it was very thin, you're not going to be able to achieve that very good. It's going to be very lumpy. It's going to be very, it's going to be very uneven, and that does not solve the inherent problem. The inherent problem is the moisture and the humidity and the changes and the fluctuations is causing the wood to warp. And just filling that crack, you're adding another material in there with a different stiffness, different mechanical properties, and that might very well may actually make the problem worse over time. Now, for hairline cracks, for thin cracks, for non-structural type cosmetic cracks, super glue and wood dust fill or general wood dust and wood glue fill, it's perfectly acceptable. I've done that a number of times on many instruments. That's not a problem at all when the crack is very thin, when it's a surface or hairline crack. If it's a large, thick, and structural crack that is going across the entire surface, you're really going to want to avoid that. Even though it's a simple fix in the beginning, it's going to probably come back and haunt you later. And it's kind of unsightly. So that's the first option, and I immediately dismissed that. I did not want to go that route unless it was absolutely 100% necessary and it was a worst case scenario. The second option is to try to clamp the ocarina together, force the gap closed, and glue it. And that option can be viable if the woods have flex and pliability to them. So this is going to work with pieces of wood that are very thin that can flex. This is not the case. Again, these Albright ocarinas are very thick. They're very thick-walled. They're very heavy. They're not going to budge. Now, I did do a test when I received the ocarina, just clamping very, very lightly to see if I see any flex in the wood. There was none, and I didn't want to push it. Because if there's no flex, you risk opening the seam on the other side. You risk cracking the wood, and you don't want to force the wood to do something that it doesn't want to do. Plus, the wood has now bowed outwards. So that means that it is settled in this forced position that's unnatural to the position when it was originally glued together. That means you have extra forces going against it, and if you try to force it closed, it's just going to add even more strain on the instrument, and you don't want to do that. So after doing a very, very, very careful, very slight flex test, I decided that was not the way to go. That was also risky, and you can't force a crack together like that. The next option is something that I saw a number of people actually comment on Facebook, and I know they had the best intentions. They were trying to help out, and the customer actually kind of posted this on one of the Facebook groups, asking for advice. And this is a very, very dangerous option and something that you should not do unless you want to destroy your instrument. And that is to pry it apart, sand it, and reglue it. That is a one-way ticket to just essentially throwing a vintage ocarina like this in the trash. I would only recommend that course of action in the case where the ocarina is so weak at the joints that it could be either pulled apart by hand or very carefully pried apart. That is not the case with this ocarina. Again, thick wall, one side is warped up, but the rest of the glue joints, the rest of the integrity of the instrument is fully intact. If you try to force the instrument apart like that, you potentially risk cracking and shattering other parts of the instrument. Now, there are instruments like guitars, like violins, recorders and oboes and other conventional orchestra woodwinds and wooden instruments that are meant to be repaired. They're either made with reversible hide glues, for example, or removable pieces, things that can be repaired. When you're making an ocarina out of wood, you really make it to be solid for the entirety of its life. And that's one of the challenges with ocarina making, is that when you glue it together, it's permanent. Unlike a recorder where you can take out the block, you can fix the block, you can do adjustments to the voicing, you don't get that option with the ocarinas. You have one shot to get it right, and it's either good or it's not. And they're really not meant to be taken apart, especially how I make my ocarinas. I use, Type Bond 3 for all the joints. I clamp the hell out of the joints. I make it so that they should never, ever come apart. And probably with how Albright was making his ocarinas, he did not, and probably did not make these to come apart as well. And, when people are saying just split it in half, immediately looking at these ocarinas, you can tell that this is not an ocarina you can split in half. It is not actually made in halves. Now, the body is made in two halves that are hollowed out and glued together. And you can see there is a seam there that goes around the body. But if you look at the mouthpiece, there are multiple seams on the mouthpiece. There's a seam running down here, there's a seam in the side, and there is a third seam at the top. So the mouthpiece block, what Alan Albright actually did, is very similar to what I do with my ocarinas, is make the body separate blocks from the mouthpiece. And for me personally, this gives me a tremendous amount of control in the voicing process, and I really like the process that I've developed for making these ocarinas. So the body might come apart in half, but the mouthpiece is 3 parts, and there's a large surface area going all the way around here, with which this block is glued to this block. So if you try to pull it apart here, you risk shattering the mouthpiece part, you risk damage and cracking, and that's going to be bad. And the mouthpiece, especially for the ocarina, the windway is the heart and soul of the instrument. If you decide to split it apart and you crack where the windway is, it's game over, and the instrument is essentially ruined. I actually have rebuilt my own ocarinas. I have sawed off the mouthpiece and redone them. I know how to do it, but most people are not going to be able to do that. And even for something like this, while I could technically do a rebuild like that, it would be highly invasive. It would be a very different instrument. And there's just all that risk in just completely shattering and destroying the instrument. And the final factor that makes that a really bad idea is this is not a single chamber ocarina. That means there is a wall between these two chambers, a thin wall running down here. If that wall cracks or shatters, the whole instrument is now unplayable, because you have leakage between the two chambers, and they're not going to act like independent, separate chambers that are played in harmony. So you have all these factors for why it's a bad idea to try to force apart an ocarina like this to fix it. The other issue you run into is that when you force it apart, you have the glue to clean off. You also have the warpage to fix, so you have to grind all the edges flush. You have to glue it back together. With that grinding, you're going to slightly change the dimensions of the chambers. That means the ocarina has to be retuned, potentially revoiced. So it is a very involved process. Even for something as seemingly simple as an ocarina, to do something like that requires a complete overhaul of the instrument. And again, these instruments, when they're made, they're not made to come apart. So that option is not viable. So what can we do? We know that in this case, the ocarina split apart, most likely because the outside dried and the grain contracted on the outside because it is dry. Well, reason goes to stand that if the process can go one way, why can't it go the other way? So if dryness caused the instruments to come apart, then it should stand that humidity should cause the grain on the outside to swell and rewarp in the other direction. And we know that something like this, in fact, actually works. Again, going back with the warped piece of Bloodwood, one way you can actually fix warped woods is by applying moisture and reintroducing moisture to the wood and apply some sort of clamping force. So in the case of this bow, let's say you want to flatten this bow out. What you would do in the case of the thin wood, you'd spray the wood with some water, just lightly dampen the surface. You would place that dampened part flat on the table and you'd apply a weight to the top. Now, as the wood reabsorbs that moisture on the bottom, the wood fibers are going to expand now, and it's going to rewarp it, and that weight pressing will help slowly rewarp it back, straighten it out, and you leave it there, let it stabilize and flatten out, and that way you can take the warp out of thin stock like this. Now, in the case of an ocarina with very thick stock, it's not quite the same. You can't just spray the outside and expect it to just warp back. It's not going to work like that because it's a thick ocarina. There's a lot of dynamics going on that you have to be careful with. So what can be done? And what I proposed to the customer was actually a method inspired by shakuhachi repair. So shakuhachi, or the Japanese flute, is traditionally made from bamboo. And bamboo flutes, especially shakuhachi, are notorious for being very prone to cracking, especially unbound flutes. Especially with changes in humidity, bamboo can be very prone to that. And there are flutes that have been fully repaired that have been completely split in half. So you can have a bamboo flute completely split. You can have small splits, you can have large splits, and that can be fully repaired. And that's done through doing, re-urushing bore, binding the instrument. But most importantly, the beginning of that process is to reintroduce moisture to the instrument. So the entire flute is put into a bag with some sort of moisture, maybe a wet paper towel or cloth, and allow the humidity to rise. And for small cracks, that humidity will cause the bamboo grain to swell back and close. In some cases, it'll heal itself. Not heal itself, it'll hold together. But in most cases, after it swells, you bind the instrument, you reseal the inside, and it's as good as new. So in this case, I figured, well, by analyzing this, I know that most likely the dryness caused it to open. So humidity will most likely cause this to close. You can't shock an instrument, though. You can't submerge it in water. You can't submit it to just high humidity all at once, because then you risk the other parts and seams of the ocarina to come apart. So what I propose to the customer is this. What I would do is I would take the instrument and I would put it in a humidity controlled chamber, and I would slowly increase the humidity of the chamber over the course of a week. I would let the ocarina stabilize for a while at that high humidity. I would make sure that the crack is closed, do the repairs, put it back in the chamber, and then dehumidify it again over the course of a week. Let the fibers reacclimate, let the stresses reacclimate back into this new position. Now, in order to supplement this, you can't just put it in there, do all this, and then expect it all to just stay closed. You want to help the wood also kind of reprogram those fibers to get rid of the residual stresses that have built up. So the first thing that I proposed doing was clamping the small side. By clamping the small side through the entire process, I ensure that any changes in the large side would not be counteracted on the small side and cause the small side to pop up. So the small side would be clamped. The second thing is, during the dehumidification process after the repair is complete, The larger side would be clamped, and it would be held clamped until it reached atmosphere standard humidity. And then I would take it out of the chamber, and I would still leave it clamped for a while so the instrument can reacclimate in the regular environment, with that clamp still making sure that the wood fibers, as it dries out, doesn't come back apart. Afterwards, I would have to go through and I'd have to kind of do a light resanding, light retouch on the seams, and just get this back into its original finished state. So I talked with the customer. They agreed, allow me to do this process. I got the Ocarina, and I began the process. So what did this process actually look like? We can actually take a look at what I did now to actually implement this. Now, before I went through all of this, after I received the Ocarina, I didn't move on the plan immediately. When I received the Ocarina, it was early in the summer. It was very hot and humid, and this was actually very favorable. Because what I would do is I would sit and I would watch the Ocarina for a period of about a week and a half, and I just see what would happen as the natural humidity around the Ocarina just changed. So over the course of a week and a half, I had the Ocarina off to the side, and I was just observing it. And I noticed that on days where it was very hot and humid, the seam would actually close very, very, very slightly. It was very minute, but on the most humid days, it was actually detectable. And this, you can actually see this in this picture here. Compared to the first picture, the gap is very, very slightly smaller. So immediately as soon as I saw that, I knew that this process would actually work. Now that I kind of confirmed my hypothesis, I got to work on the setup. So in this picture, you can actually see how this whole thing was implemented. I got a large, clear, clean plastic container. In one corner of the container, I put a small glass bowl of clean, fresh distilled water. And I want to make sure to use distilled water because I don't want mold being introduced or growing in this setup, especially since this is going to be in a very humid, more elevated temperature for an extended period of time. And especially with the wood, I didn't want mold forming. So I used very clean distilled water to create the humid environment. On the left side, next to that, you can actually see the Ocarina. Now the Ocarina is standing up on its side, and you can see the Ocarina is clamped on the one side, and that's the small chamber. So I used a couple of wood clamps, and I made sure to clamp it with rubber padding so I wouldn't mar the or damage the Ocarina. And I compressed that side, and I just had it sitting in there in the chamber. In the chamber, I also had a temperature and humidity sensor, so I could just actively monitor it over the course of time as this process was going on. So over the course of a week, I slowly increased the humidity of the chamber. And the way I did that was I took the lid, I started with it a bit cracked open at a certain humidity, and each day I kind of closed it more and more. So it started out at about 55% humidity, and by the time it was fully sealed, the humidity reached a maximum of 90%. Again, you don't want to shock the wood. You can't just do this all at once because you can cause issues with other parts just changing too rapidly and causing other seams to open up potentially. So I did this again, very controlled over the course of over a week, raising the humidity up a little by little, so that ways the Ocarina would have time to absorb the moisture and slowly acclimate to this change. Once this was reached the peak humidity, I let it sit there probably for another half a week or so, just so that it would have time to stabilize out and acclimate to this new high humidity setting. Now, in the next picture, you can actually see at the peak humidity, that gap has shrunk massively. It has now become a hairline crack. It's almost shrunk by itself. If I took it out, the wood would probably open back up again. So here is where the real key happened. In order to finalize the sealing of that crack, what I did first was I briefly took it out of the chamber. I checked if that gap could be closed, because now it's a hairline gap. Even if I clamped it, I could force it together much easier than if it was open. So I put a clamp on it with rubber padding, and I gently clamped down, and I could actually see that seam now being able to close. So I knew that this would work, but I really only have one shot to get this right. So what I did was I reintroduced in the humidity chamber, let it sit for another couple days. Then I got prepared. I got some ultra thin wicking CA glue, and I got the clamps ready. I got the new rubber piece for the other side ready. I applied the super thin wicking glue all along the seam, make sure to saturate everything heavily so that it would get across all the surfaces, and then I clamped fast. And I had to make sure that everything was set up exactly. I had to make sure the clamp was ready in place, because this type of CA glue dries fast. I had a few seconds probably before it would dry. And in a closed saturated environment, the CA glue would probably take a little bit longer. So I had a little bit of buffer room, but I really only had one shot to get this right. Otherwise, the CA glue would seal, but it wouldn't be clamped, and it might not hold. So I applied it. I quickly clamped it. I made sure I could see that kind of squeeze out to know that I was successful. I wiped off kind of the excess on the outside. I put the whole thing back in the chamber, closed it fully, and just let it sit at maximum humidity for another half a week, again, to restabilize. And then over the course of another week, I brought the humidity back down. Everything fully clamped, slowly opening up, cracking that container up a little bit more, and making sure that the instrument has a time to readjust, reacclimate. So by the end of the week, it was back down to about 60% humidity. I took it out of the chamber and I just left it on the table with all the clamps on, again, for probably another half a week to a week, so that it would have time to reacclimate now to the open air environment, and have the clamps there to prevent any residual stresses from opening up the joint prematurely. And I also wanted to make sure that this was fully stabilized before I started work on it, taking the clamps off. And that was really the key here. This whole process is not only to close the gap, but it's to reacclimate the wood, redistribute the stresses, so that way as you get rid of that warpage stress, and that way as well it's dehumidifying. If there's any stresses that come back, that clamp is going to hold it in place and kind of keep the wood and help train the fibers to keep closed together again under lower humidity conditions. So afterwards, I took the clamps off and I set it on the table and I let it just sit for another half a week. There's a lot of waiting in this process, but for vintage Ocarina repair, you really want to do this right. So I wanted to make sure that the crack would not open up, and it didn't. And at that point, I knew it was safe to start the touch-up work on the Ocarina. So I went through and I did sanding on the ocarina. Very, very light sanding. I didn't do any heavy sanding. I really only sanded this, I think, I started on like 1,000 grit. I went up to 2,000 grit and I did a buffing sanding at 3,000 grit going along the surfaces. I used one of my very fine Japanese marking knives to also kind of scrape the seam to make sure all the glue was off. Very, very carefully to leave no scratches, to really not change the structure of the ocarina. I wanted to keep this in its original form without any traces of repair work done on this ocarina. Finally, after that was all said and done and it all looked good, I put it up on my drying racks, and I did the finishing. And for this process, I talked to the customer. I said we could do the original finish or we could do kind of a new finish. And the customer agreed that kind of keeping the original finish would be best, just to keep the original form of this instrument. And also, kind of one thing to mention, one of the touch-ups that I did was on the mouthpiece. You can't see it now, but there was a bunch of scuff and scratch marks on it. So I actually lightly filed and sanded those out to give the mouthpiece, a nice cleaned up look. This is a wood ocarina, and even on my ocarinas, you can actually see some of the tooling marks. That's just part of the process, human process of working with the wood. And there's a certain point of where you can sand and sand and sand and sand, and there's kind of diminishing returns to try to get everything all out. So even on this, you can kind of see the tooling marks. I offer the option if my customer wanted me to remove the tooling marks or just leave it kind of in that original form. And I think we both agreed that the original finish, the original tooling marks minus like the little scuff marks that were touched up here, was the best way to go. So for finishing, I actually reached out to Alan Albright himself, and kind of talked with him about it, and he let me know that he used pure tongue oil originally for his ocarinas. So I got some very high grade pure tongue oil, and over the course of almost 2 weeks, I did the application. So tongue oil works best. Pure tongue oil works best first thinned out, so it dries faster. So I got naturally cut tongue oil with pine solvent. You wipe it onto the surface, you let it sit for about a half an hour, and then you rub it off. It's very counterintuitive, especially from like my other processes where I do my varnish. I put the layer on and I just let it dry and cure and keep building layers. For tongue oil, if you leave it on, it's going to get sticky and it's actually not going to cure and dry well. So you have to wipe it on and then wipe it off and keep doing that over and over and over and over again. So I did about 10 layers of this, and I did, one super thin coat each day for the course of 10 days. And then you have to let it sit. And pure tongue oil takes a minimum of 30 days to cure. So I had this sitting on the side for over a month just to let it cure. And afterwards, I actually went on my Korea trip for the month. So that actually worked out well. I came back. Everything was still all together. The seam was fully together. And it looked and felt exactly how it was when I received this from my customer, minus the crack. So at that point, the ocarina was considered done. So this was a very lengthy process. Again, this was probably this was definitely a 2.5 month process. Even for something you would think as simple as just a crack repair, can be very involved, especially with something like this where it's a structural crack. It's with thick woods, heavy woods, thick walls. Ripping an instrument apart like this is not the best way to go. I wanted to preserve the original form of the ocarina, the original intent of the maker, and to restore, this beautiful vintage ocarina to its former glory. So while we have the chance, let's take a look at the ocarina. I don't know exactly what what wood was used for this. It's wood identification can be very challenging, especially with woods that look very similar. And this could be many, many types of woods. I really don't know what type it is, but it's a very, very, very heavy wood for that. It's kind of open grain wood, has this really nice dark brown and black striping in it. Um, you know, Beautiful little ocarina. You can see, the grain going around. And again, a look at that repaired surface. No crack at all. And looks like it's its new old self again. I'm very happy with how this restoration turned out. This was my first ocarina repair and restoration. And at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that going forward, I would officially be offering wooden ocarina repair and restorations. So what does that mean? For anyone who has, an older wooden ocarina, doesn't matter who the maker is or whatever, if you have an ocarina that has anything from scratches to dents to hairline cracks, that you just want, filled or sanded out or smoothed, or if you want the original finish touched up after years of use, or if you want a whole different finish put on it, or if you want major repairs done, like larger cracks or checks or failing glue joints, I will actually be officially offering that for the Ocarina community. And I think, as far as I'm aware, this is really the first time that such a repair service has been made available to the Ocarina community. Again, the Ocarina is very niche. Chances are not a lot of people are going to take advantage of it. It does cost. I don't do this for free. I do have to charge for the time and, the labor and the materials and stuff. But it is something that I am in, I think, a unique position to be able to offer. And again, because I make the ocarinas, I know how they're made. I, know how their voice, how they're supposed to play, sound, how they're put together. I think I can bring a lot of my own knowledge and expertise in making my instruments into helping repair and refresh kind of old instruments that people have that they don't feel confident doing themselves, or for major stuff like this requires more specialty knowledge to pull off. So that is something that I will be offering, and you can see more details on the Brady Instruments website. So everything from just kind of really small, minor cosmetic things to a little bit more intensive repair work. I think it'll be kind of a nice new addition to the world of ocarinas, especially as more people look for vintage ocarinas like these, buy ones, trade them, and just go about using them. Again, other woodwinds out there, you can bring typical concert woodwinds, orchestral woodwinds, orchestral instruments to violin shops. There's guitar shops, there's woodwind specialty repair shops, but you can't really do that for wooden ocarinas. It's kind of nice to be able to apply my skill set to helping others with instruments that they have that they would like fixed or repaired, that they wouldn't be able to get done otherwise. So with that kind of wraps up this whole process. It was a very long video. It's even for something like an ocarina, it can be still very labor intensive to do properly. And I've said this in many of my other videos, even just crafting them from scratch. It is quite a journey. So I hope this was an informative video and contribute something. a little bit new and different to the ocarina world because there's a lot of people who have talked about repairing clay ocarinas, gluing back together shattered or chipped or, kind of reforming damaged clay or even plastic ocarinas. But no one has really touched upon wooden ocarina, truly intensive wooden ocarina repair besides, general maintenance, oiling your ocarinas. Um, so this was a challenging but I think very rewarding process. This ocarina is going to be going back to its home and hopefully enjoyed now for years to come from um, its original owner. Um, this ocarina probably will need some extra care and attention to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Um, Now, the repair process, there's a lot of risk. I can't, guarantee necessarily that it'll essentially last forever or indefinitely. I tried my best, to make sure that this not only was back in its original form, but, will hold together as long as possible. But there's some, special considerations for something like this that should be kept for maintaining it for as long as possible in the future. So potentially refinishing with pure tung oil again down the road, keeping it a little bit more humidity controlled environment, things like that. So I want to give my hats off to Mr. Alan Albright, for sharing his craft with the world, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to help restore one of these vintage and sought after ocarinas for someone. And it'll be interesting to see if there are more opportunities that come up to help give new life to ocarinas like this. So, with that, I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.